President Cyril Ramaphosa giving a briefing later with the French President Emmanuel Macron, the Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros Ghrebeyesus, about the issue of vaccines. France first opposed the idea of a waiver on intellectual property for vaccines, but it appears Macron may now be changing his mind. Today, France is also discussing an RNA technology transfer hub for COVID-19 vaccines. Well, Timothy Fish-Hodgson's a legal advisor for economic, social and cultural rights at the International Commission of Jurists. Timothy, good afternoon to you. I mean, France seemed to oppose the idea of what's called the TRIPS waiver, basically sort of waiving the rights to intellectual property. Now it seems to be changing its mind. Do you see it like that? Do you think they might back this move to release the intellectual property?
So the first thing, good afternoon, Stephen. The first thing is that France has flip-flopped on the TRIPS waiver, the so-called TRIPS waiver, and the European Union itself has not found its way towards supporting the TRIPS waiver yet, although France does seem to be supporting the TRIPS waiver. But that waiver is supposed to be for a temporary period of several years for all COVID-19 therapeutics, including vaccines and all sorts of other things needed in the treatment of COVID-19. Now, this announcement that you're talking about that the President has made, that we're anticipating later today, would be about sharing of know-how and sharing of information, which presumably, but we don't know the details yet, would have to do with some pharmaceutical companies sharing with a hub in South Africa information and know-how on how to produce vaccines in South Africa and for the region. That's not quite the same thing as allowing for a waiver for the whole world. So these are still two separate things that need to be pursued at the same time.
Okay, I'm going to come back to the RNA technology transfer hub. I'm not going to Google that just yet. But in the meantime, what does France lose by not supporting the waiver? Do its companies, does it stand to lose money in some way if it allows the intellectual property to be used freely?
So in one way, it's a mystery why more so-called developed countries in the global north haven't supported the waiver. But in another way, it isn't, because as you say, whether there's companies inside of the countries or whether they just have a vested interest in supporting big capital, so in supporting big companies to protect their financial interests. And in this instance, it's pharmaceutical companies. And it seems like many of the big countries in the world have for a very long time had that interest. And also before that, maybe were a bit worried that if they didn't protect their companies or the companies that they would be dealing with in other countries, that they wouldn't be able to secure vaccine access for themselves first. So it's somewhat hypocritical to see countries like the USA and France, after long periods of time, changing their tune, once it is the case that they've already gained such an advantage that they've procured all the vaccines that they need for their populations.
I mean, I suppose what could happen, I mean, I don't know, let me put this idea to you, that, you know, countries like the US, the UK vaccinate their populations very quickly. There's still a ton of money to be made to keep those factories operating at full speed, to make more vaccine doses, to sell them to countries like us, and to charge $1 a dose. We would have no choice but to buy it, but at $1 a dose, you'd still be making a lot of profit.
So the question again is, and the diminishing or the waiving of intellectual property rights has never been, and this is a myth that's sold by the companies and their supporters. It's never been that people are saying that companies should not be able to make any money off of their production of vaccines. The question is the extent of the profits that they are making, and the fact that the vaccines are unaffordable, not only not provided for free, and that the intellectual property rights that they are refusing to share and the information that they're refusing to share are making things unaffordable so that they are out of reach of other countries. In general, what you're saying is correct. There are ways to make profits off of vaccine technology and other medication without charging those exorbitant prices. And that's the reason why in many other respects with many other different drugs, there are major generic manufacturing industries which sell at much lower prices but still be able to exist solely on selling those medications.
The RNA technology transfer hub, I mean, basically the idea is it's a technology transfer to help people make vaccines. I mean, isn't this kind of information a bit like a genie or toothpaste? Once it's out of the lamp, once it's out of the tube, you can't really put it back again. The knowledge will move around the world anyway.
So the thing that's difficult about this, Stephen, is that obviously there's lots of companies that are already making this type of vaccine. But it's not, we tend to think about it as one, so there's sort of one recipe or one intellectual property secret. But intellectual property rights cover a whole lot of things, from processes of manufacturing things to combinations of things to orders of things. And this complete know-how and technology is what is being protected by patents. Now, my understanding is, and we'll find out more later, that this type of hub would not be just for South Africa. At the moment, local manufacturers in South Africa could potentially put together vaccines for COVID-19 if they're already given the ingredients that allow them to be formed. And so this is what's happening here currently in South Africa and what we can do in our factories here in South Africa. What is missing is the technology and the information and the know-how to be able to go from scratch and create mRNA vaccines. And this is what would be transmitted to these knowledge hubs all over the world. It's also just a matter of time until there's so many different effective vaccines in so many different countries in the world that the profitability of the vaccines is diminished for the pharmaceutical companies. And this is one of the reasons why they're trying to recoup such very big profits in this proportion of time, because I think that they know that they won't always be profiting in the same way from it. But irrespective of that, it's immoral, it's unethical, and it's against human rights for them to have acted the way that they have, and for governments to have allowed them to do so and actually supported them, mostly for protection of the interests of themselves and their own populations.
Do you think the international pressure is beginning to tell? I mean, it's one thing for countries like India and South Africa, as we have joined together, to push for countries to get involved in this and to lift the intellectual property. But when the United States starts to talk in the same way, I would like to think that it would have an impact on a country like France.
So I think that we would like to think as activists and as human rights activists that the pressure that we're putting on governments and on companies is having some sort of an effect. And definitely the People's Vaccine Campaign, the pressures have been considerable all over the world, and there was considerable pressure within the United States of America, for example. What the motivations of countries are will depend from place to place and political condition to political condition, depending on the pressure of their own populations, the security of the governments and the leaders there to that type of pressure, if they need to listen or if they don't need to listen. And also then an important thing to remember about the US or France or anyone else supporting a TRIPS waiver is that it's not necessarily the case. They're not announcing that they're supporting the waiver in the form suggested by South Africa and India, which importantly includes not only vaccines but all other therapeutics and know-how and technology relating to COVID-19. But it might be that we find Joe Biden or the US trying to reduce the coverage of that and reduce its effectiveness, and then we would still need to fight against that. So I can't really answer your question without going into specific details about particular countries, but I think that there is some sign that things are crumbling and that the pressure that has been put on them, and also just the severe pressure that people are under to get vaccines as people continue to die, while we see, for example, in Europe, major sports competitions with packed stadiums, that the hypocrisy just is becoming too palpable and governments have to give in.
I suppose one way of answering the question might be it depends on whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden in the White House. Maybe that gets us some of the way. Timothy Fish-Hodgson, thank you, legal advisor, economic, social and cultural rights, International Commission of Jurists for Africa. I do appreciate the time. Thank you.